So this video is something that I've long been interested in talking about since I think there's some interesting discussion to be had. What is the ideal order to read the Chronicles of Narnia series in? It's a fun question. It's kind of similar to the question of what order to watch Star Wars in, but I feel like there's been more written about the ideal watch order of Star Wars than there is written about the ideal reading order for Narnia, because Star Wars is just much bigger than Narnia. That's probably why. But if you're curious, I like the machete order for Star Wars. I feel like that's a somewhat common consensus. I've seen a good amount of people agree with that option. Um, but I don't know if I've ever seen the exact order that I've decided that I like for Narnia. I don't know if I've seen what I'm going to talk about this order suggested before at all, so I'm going to make this video. Also, another thing, the answers for Star Wars, like the watch order for that, that's always written as like, what order do you want to watch Star Wars in for the first ever time? I don't know if I want to say this is the ideal order for specifically reading Narnia for the very first time. It's just an order that I like. I determined that I like this order because I recently reread the series. My reason for rereading it was because at the end of this year we're getting a new Narnia movie from director Greta Gerwig. No idea if I'm going to like that, but I'm kind of cautiously optimistic. But yeah, anyway, let's get into my order and then my discussion of it. How I want to do this is look at each of the books, discuss it, and then lock into place what spot I want it to put in the order. And then that way we'll eventually get all 7 in the order that I want. So you might think that I'm going to start with the first book, the book to read first. But there's actually a dispute of which book should get read first, and I want to wait a second before I get into any real dispute or discussion. So can I start with a book that nobody's ever going to dispute the placement of? And the one that fits there is The Last Battle. The Last Battle you can read at the very end. Read that one last. That makes sense. I've heard once this idea of that actually maybe read The Magician's Nephew, which is the series' overall prequel. You could read that one last after The Last Battle. And the reason people maybe say that is the publishing order was Magician's Nephew came before Last Battle, but the writing for Last Battle was fully finished before the writing for Magician's Nephew got fully finished. So that's kind of interesting. Even though I usually like going with just the writing order, I really don't think reading it in this order, Magician's Nephew, or Last Battle first, then Magician's Nephew, I just don't think that makes any sense. I think you definitely want to have experienced like everything else that Narnia has to offer before you see it end. Is it a good ending? I've always been pretty mixed on it. On my recent reread, I was kind of able to appreciate some of the topics that it's trying to explore. Like the idea of a false prophet is interesting, and in general, it just has some neat theological observations. And it's probably just the most mature Narnia book. That's probably why I saw it as the outlier and the one that I just didn't like as much as a kid. Also, there are definitely elements that just maybe haven't aged well. Maybe with theology, but more with things like one of the plot points is that the characters do brown face for a stretch, so there's something you don't see every day. But yeah, anyway, the book's quality doesn't really matter for this discussion. I think I've discussed what I want to say about it. I'm going to lock it in as the book that's going last in the order, so 7th. So now let's jump into what book to read first. There's really only 2 out of the remaining 6 that are contenders here. The Magician's Nephew, like I mentioned, it's the prequel to the overall series, and then The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the original story in the novel that started it all, which was being written and also published first. I'm going to say read Lion and Witch and the Wardrobe first for just a lot of reasons, because it was written first, but really my bigger reason is just the way that Narnia is introduced in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe is basically iconic, I'd say, at this point. Also, Magician's Nephew, being a prequel, it's kind of written as if the reader's already familiar with things like Narnia and Aslan. It would almost be like contradictory to read Magician's Nephew before Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, just based on how the information is like presented. I'm biased because this order is how I always did it, but I just really can't see a ton of value in having Magician's Nephew go very first. So yeah, start with Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. What do I think of that book? Well, I really like it, and I consider it a pretty iconic piece of work of fiction. The story of Peter and Susan, Edmund and Lucy Pevensie finding Narnia and meeting Aslan, it's really great, and as author C.S. Lewis puts it, it's a supposition, which is kind of a cool term. And its presentation and pacing, I just really like that too. My one nitpick is that one element of the ending of the book has weird interpretations if you think about it too much, but since it's magic, you can generally kind of hand wave it, not worry about it, or maybe even rationalize ways to make the logic of it just sound a little better. But that's a minor thing. Overall, it's a very wonderful book, and I'm going to lock it in as the starting point for the series in my order. So now which book next? You could definitely read Magician's Nephew right after Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It is a prequel to the entire series, but many of the elements that it's kind of addressing are related to just Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe. I kind of like this idea, the placement of Magician's Nephew right after Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, but I think I want to keep Magician's Nephew on the back burner for a little bit longer, though. There's another spot I'm going to use it in that I just like a little bit better. Similarly, you could throw in The Horse and His Boy next, since that's set during the big time skip that's described at the end of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But I have a reason that I want to put Horse and His Boy a bit later in the order also. Part of my reasoning for this is, again, the order of the writing of the stories. Magician's Nephew and Horse and His Boy, they were written a little later, so before getting to them, I want to read what was written earlier. So now the only option is actually to read Prince Caspian next. So my thoughts on that? I like Prince Caspian, but I do actually think it's one of the weaker entries in the series, unfortunately. I think the opening and initial return to Narnia is a pretty interesting premise, and the big long flashback that you get in there is some pretty cool story structure. The book is kind of trying to tell a story about overcoming a lack or a crisis of faith, and it's doing that in a way that's palatable for kids, so that's pretty neat. But the second half has just less perfect pacing, and the ending is not too perfectly strongly designed, I almost feel. I can definitely appreciate that Narnia, in contrast to something like J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth, it's less elaborately and rigidly defined with its world-building rules. But in this book, I'm almost feeling the looseness of it just a little bit too much. There's just stuff thrown in there. I'm not sure I really get it. But Prince Caspian generally does work really well as a sequel to The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, so I will lock it in as the book to read second. Okay, next up, still not going to do the prequel or the intraquel that I was mentioning, and I'm going to further explain why when I get to them. But I think after meeting the titular character in Prince Caspian, just go right on and embark with him on the voyage of the Dawn Treader. No need to put anything in between these two. But I do want to give my thoughts on this next book. I think Voyage of the Dawn Treader is my favorite in the series, and I think that's been my opinion since my first ever read as a kid. Voyage of the Dawn Treader is unique since instead of having an overall conflict and a main antagonist or a primary villain, it's really just more episodic. This fantasy story gets to show off several amazing fantastical places and adventures. And what's even more special is that each one is an opportunity for one or more characters to learn a good lesson. So, wonderful story, and I'm going to lock it as the third book to read. Okay, so from here we have 3 books left to place, and placing them is kind of interesting since you could realistically have any of them go next. I've seen some people say that it makes a lot of sense to go from Voyage of the Dawn Treader right into the Silver Chair. That's a perfectly valid take, but I don't think I want to do that. The reason this idea gets suggested is that the Silver Chair has Eustace Clarence Scrubb as a major character, and we're introduced to him in Voyage of the Dawn Treader. But I said major, not main character. Silverchair's first primary main character is actually Jo Pole, and the book is kind of written with her point of view taking main focus. So I actually think it's kind of cool to put another story in before we revisit Eustace. Now, when we do meet him again, when we eventually read Silverchair, we're viewing him as someone who has had experience with Narnia, but if we haven't just immediately previously read about his Narnia experience, then we're closer to kind of what Jill's perspective is on him. If Voyage of the Dawn Treader is less fresh in our mind. Basically, what we're going to do is take a break from the main story arc, since it's going to be shifting who the focus is coming from in between the books. And so, which book should we read as our break from that main story arc? I'll say I still don't want to do Magician's Nephew yet. I just don't think you gain anything by having it in this spot specifically. Also, again, it was written later, so I want to have it pretty relatively late in the reading order. So that means that we're going to read Horse and His Boy next. Does that make sense? It would be really ideal if there was someone introduced in Voyage of the Dawn Treader that's going to feature prominently in Horse and His Boy, which is the one that I'm suggesting to read next. Does that work? Unfortunately, there's not somebody that fits since all the books take place at different points in Narnian history, but there is something that I think kind of works. So in the section of Voyage of the Dawn Treader that's set on the Lone Islands, Caspian and the rest of the major characters in that book help abolish the islands' slave trade system. And in learning how slavery became a thing on the Lone Islands, we hear a little bit about how the nation of Calormen, located south of Narnia, we hear about that place. And I think it's the first time that we ever hear about this country in the series if you're going based on the order of when they were written and published. So first exposure to Calormen. And what we do here paints Calormen as just a pretty terrible place to be. It's one of the many interesting ideas that's briefly touched on in Voyage of the Dawn Treader, but I think it sets the stage really well to go right into Horse and His Boy as the next one, because that story is set in Calormen and it features characters trying to escape it. And also, Horse and His Boy was written as the next one right after Voyage of the Dawn Treader, even though it didn't get published until after Silverchair. And one last thing, there's actually a line in the Silverchair that technically spoils a major part of the ending of The Horse and His Boy. So it might be good to read Horse and His Boy before Silverchair just to be safe. So that's everything I have to mention on why Horse and His Boy is next. So now I'll mention what I think of this book. I think The Horse and His Boy is super underrated, and it's one of my favorite stories in the series, actually. It's pretty cool to see a story that's just set fully in the Narnian world. No England, no Earth. And it's specifically during the golden age of Narnia, so that's cool. There's some stuff about Calormen and that country, and people have argued that some of it just hasn't aged well, but for me it's more of a problem with the stuff in Calormen that's in Last Battle. In this book, I think nothing is hugely bothering me about that. Last Battle is where it gets more notable. But what really made me like this story especially is something that I kind of just put together on my most recent reread. This is almost like an allegory for like the Underground Railroad. I don't know that this was really the intent, since C.S. Lewis was British, not American, and the Underground Railroad was an American part of history. But there's kind of neat parallels, since you have characters that are traveling north to escape a backwards region that practices slavery. So that's that. And one last reason that I like Horse and His Boy so much is, although Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is still probably the better starting point, how this book uses and introduces Aslan to the other characters, I think it's really fresh in this book. So let's lock Horse and His Boy as the book that we're going to read fourth. Now we just have to figure out what order we want to read the last two books that we haven't placed yet, so Magician's Nephew and Silverchair. This was the trickiest part of coming up with the order that I liked. I think there's pros and cons for doing it each way, but one way I eventually concluded just outweighs the other. If we keep generally going in the order of how the stories were written, then Silverchair would be next, then Magician's Nephew after it. Going from Horse and His Boy right into Silverchair is interesting. So that would be a story about escaping to Narnia and the north, and then going right into a story that's set partially in the wild wastelands to the north of Narnia, which is a region that has been mentioned in previous stories at this point. So north, up, continuing north into the setting of the next book. I don't know if that's quite as interesting as it sounds, though. Another angle, the villains of Horse and His Boy and Silverchair, they maybe contrast a little nicely, because both Rabbitash and then the Lady of the Green Kirtle, they're each trying to use a character of the opposite gender as them for their evil plans, sort of. But again, I don't think that's too much of a connecting narrative through line either. Let me think about it as we'd be going from Magician's Nephew right into Last Battle. They had their writing finalized around the same time, but honestly, I don't see a nice connection that directly bridges them. Like, although they are the two books that Polly Plummer appears in, Diggory Kirk, the other child character from Magician's Nephew, he's in these two, and then also Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, because he's the professor. But these books with Polly and Diggory, they take place at different times, and so like young children in one, and then they become middle-aged wise adults in the next one between the two books. So I almost want to like put another story in between these two appearances to account for the time jump and then their aging between the appearances. I can actually do that though, if I do it with Silverchair. Let me map out how that would look like. So after the original Pevensie trilogy, I'll call it, read Horse and His Boy, then Magician's Nephew, then Silverchair, then Last Battle. Honestly, the more I think about this arrangement, the more I like it. After reading one story that's set outside the main story arc, you next do the other one. Magician's Nephew doesn't have any connection really or overlap with Horse and His Boy, but putting the integral and then the prequel back to back is kind of cool, so I think it works. And Magician's Nephew does lead into Silverchair pretty well, because the former explores the origin of Narnia, but also how evil entered it, and then the evil in this case is Jadis, who becomes the White Witch. But just the fact that we're getting reintroduced to a witch is a neat preparation for the witch in Silverchair, even though they're probably not the same character. We actually don't know anything about the origin of the Lady of the Green Kirtle, but she's compared to Jadis, so I think learning more about the latter than meeting the former, it works, it's good. It's kind of the same logic of how some of the Star Wars watch order suggestions, they try to place Rogue One in there somewhere, and some of them put it right before Return of the Jedi, because both that and the original Star Wars have a Death Star, and then Rogue One is information about the Death Star, but it's the Death Star in the original movie, but it's still, learning more about a Death Star. Kind of like how this, you'd be learning more about a witch. So, the connector through line of Magician's Nephew into Silverchair is the fact that evil witches are in both stories. I think that works. Now, what I think about the actual story of Magician's Nephew now that I placed it. Magician's Nephew is good, but I feel like the opening chunk is maybe stronger than certain later parts. Meeting Diggory's crazy magician uncle, and especially discovering new places like Charn, is so eerie and otherworldly at such a unique tone, that it's more whimsical for the actual creation of Narnia. The story could fully fizzle out, but I think it doesn't really, since by the end, you do get another reappearance of Jadis, just to give a little bit of interesting conflict at the end of the story. And then the very last chapter title, the end of this story and the beginning of all the others, that goes so hard. I noticed on my reread that I especially enjoy Lewis's narration and voice both in the prose, but also the chapter titling. That title is actually my last reason for putting Magician's Nephew in this spot. Others, plural stories, means it's a prequel to the other 6 books, but it can also technically suggest that you have at least 2 more stories to read after you read Magician's Nephew. So by locking Magician's Nephew as the 5th book to read, we have that, and that works. So now we just have Silverchair. I'll share my thoughts on it, but I want to make a few more notes on why it's in this spot in the order. I mentioned having Diggory and Polly age like off-page between their appearances, and now we actually get that for Caspian too, because he was a young man in Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and then when we see him again in his next appearance a few books later, Silverchair, he's aged into an old man, and we got that kind of off-page while we were reading other stuff. He also has a missing relatively young son. They're not clear on the age, but I think with Rillian, the timeline of Rillian's age in relation to Caspian's age just maybe never made a ton of sense to me. But if you don't do Caspian's appearances back to back, it's maybe a little easier to ignore that and not like hyperfixate on how old they're supposed to be. So that's another benefit. One last thing is that by having Silverchair be second to last, Jill, who I talked about before, is the last character of the Friends of Narnia to ever get introduced. And I kind of like this since it gives her a special status and she's really important for those last 2 books. Also, I think having her 2 appearances back to back is nicer than if there was a break in between, because she doesn't age in between the books really. As far as we know, apparently, according to, there's a companion piece timeline thing, apparently there's a full 7 years that passed on Earth between Silverchair and Last Battle, but I just never got the sense of that from just reading the books. If it was intended and it was more obviously shown in the books that there's supposed to be so much time between those 2, I would maybe not have put these 2 books back to back, but I think it works since it's not made explicit how much time on Earth is between Silverchair and Last Battle. That's interesting. So just from the books, we maybe know the Narnian side of the timeline a little more accurately than the Earth side. Interesting. That's not relevant at this point, though. I'm rambling. What are my thoughts on Silverchair? The Silverchair is another favorite of mine. It's exploring another section of the Narnian world with another fun group of characters. I like the setting, being in the cold and or the underground. It just gives the book a real more unique vibe. But I think the strongest part is the exploration of things like following the signs, and then morality and faith, confronting evil and healing all the harms. It's just all good stuff. And so we're going to lock Silverchair as the book to read 6th or second to last. So there, we have our entire reading order. I like it and I think it makes sense. To summarize, we're going to start with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where we're introduced to the Pevensies and Aslan and Narnia as a whole. Then we read Prince Caspian as a sequel, followed next by The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which is a highlight, and also it's kind of a branching off point, because just as that voyage is exploring more of the Narnian world, we readers are going to do that too, because we're jumping into 2 side stories. We're going to learn more about Calormen by reading The Horse and His Boy, and then we're going to learn how Narnia began in the very first story, chronologically, which is The Magician's Nephew. After that, we're going to dive more into the evils that Narnia faces with another witch and the story of the Silver Chair. And that puts us back on the main story arc, which we're going to finish by reading the last battle. And with that, we've experienced the entire Chronicles of Narnia series. I think this order works pretty well, so I'm going to call it my ideal order, but it is just my opinion, so that's all. That's my thoughts. Thank you for watching my YouTube video.